It was a freezing night in Vienna, 1963. A man in a gray overcoat stood beneath the flickering streetlight outside a cafe that had long since closed. In his hand was a small envelope. Inside it, microfilm containing lists of Soviet advisors stationed in Damascus and Cairo. A few blocks away, a black Volga sedan idled silently, its headlights off. Inside, two men from the KGB's first chief directorate watched through the fogged glass, waiting for the handover. The man in the overcoat was a Mossad operative, deep undercover, and he was seconds away from being discovered. That's how most people imagine the Cold War. A silent duel between the CIA and the KGB. But what the world never saw was the hidden front line. A war of spies between Mossad and the KGB, waged from the streets of Europe to the deserts of the Middle East. Before we dive deeper, if you love true spy stories like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next classified file. And tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? I'm reading everyone. Now, back to the mission. When the Cold War began, Israel was a young nation surrounded by enemies and starved of allies. The Soviet Union, once an early supporter of Israel's independence in 1948, had shifted its allegiance to the Arab world. Moscow armed Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, training their pilots, engineers, and intelligence officers. That shift meant one thing for Mossad: Israel AES enemies were no longer just across its borders. They were being shaped, trained, and advised by KGB handlers. By the early 1950s, the KGB had begun recruiting informants in Tel Aviv, embedding them inside Israel's embassies and research institutions. Some were Soviet Jews who had immigrated to Israel under false identities. Others were ideological sympathizers, and some were simply blackmailed, their families still trapped behind the Iron Curtain. Mossad quickly realized this wasn't a traditional spy war. It wasn't about secrets. It was about control. The first major confrontation happened quietly, in 1953, when Israeli counterintelligence detected irregular radio transmissions near the Defense Ministry. The signals were traced to a Soviet-built shortwave transmitter hidden inside an apartment rented by a Czech journalist. Within hours, Mossad operatives stormed the flat. The man inside bit down on a cyanide capsule before they could question him. The microfilm they recovered changed everything. It contained partial transcripts of Israeli military communications, meaning the KGB had already infiltrated deep into the country's defense network. That discovery pushed Mossad to build one of the most sophisticated counterintelligence divisions in the world. Their mission: hunt Soviet spies, turn them, and dismantle the KGB's network from the inside. Behind the Iron Curtain, the KGB viewed Mossad as a Western pawn, a proxy for the CIA, operating with American technology but far fewer scruples. In Moscow, the leadership labeled Israel an imperialist outpost, accusing its intelligence services of destabilizing Soviet allies in the Middle East. To the KGB, Mossad was small but dangerous, unpredictable, cunning, and unrelenting. In one declassified analysis years later, a Soviet officer described Mossad agents as mathematicians with knives. They calculated everything, but never hesitated to act. That wasn't far from the truth. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, Mossad used European capitals as their hunting grounds. Vienna, Paris, and West Berlin became chessboards where both sides moved assets, staged assassinations, and conducted tradecraft games with deadly precision. Each defector, each intercepted courier, each coded telegram carried consequences that rippled all the way from Moscow to Jerusalem. One of the earliest Israeli coups came in 1961, when Mossad successfully extracted a Soviet engineer from Czechoslovakia. The man carried blueprints of a new radar system being installed in Egyptian MiG bases, Soviet-made, and nearly impossible to jam. Mossad shared the intelligence with Israeli Air Force strategists, who began devising countermeasures that would prove decisive years later during the Six-Day War. The KGB was furious. Within months, they retaliated, infiltrating an Israeli scientific research center through one of its top medical researchers, Marcus Klingberg, who secretly passed data to Moscow for decades. The espionage war had officially escalated. As Israel's regional conflicts grew, so did the stakes. By the mid-1960s, Soviet officers were training Arab pilots just a few hundred miles from Israel's border. Mossad began tracking their schedules, intercepting their transmissions, and even recruiting translators from the very bases where Soviet advisors worked. But what truly terrified the KGB wasn't Israel's technology. It was Mossad's efficiency. The Israelis didn't have the resources of the CIA or MI6, but they had one advantage the Soviets didn't: urgency born from survival. For every KGB agent Mossad caught, 3 more appeared. And yet, the Israelis adapted, changing codes weekly, rotating agents, using airline crews as couriers, and setting up front companies across Europe. By 1965, the two agencies had developed a grudging respect for each other. They never met officially, but in the underworld of espionage, each understood the other's capabilities. In Eastern Europe, Mossad operatives often clashed with KGB surveillance teams while extracting Jewish families and dissidents bound for Israel. Sometimes they exchanged bullets, other times silent nods. This wasn't a war for land or ideology anymore. It was a war of information, loyalty, and fear. The kind fought in whispers, not headlines. And as the Cold War deepened, both sides realized something chilling. The next great battlefield wouldn't be fought in Moscow or Tel Aviv. It would be fought in Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad, where Soviet-trained Arab agents and Mossad operatives were already circling each other in the shadows. That's where the real story begins. By the late 1960s, the secret war between Mossad and the KGB had moved from a game of surveillance into a deadly contest of recruitment and infiltration. Neither agency could defeat the other outright, so both turned to the oldest weapon in espionage: people. For Mossad, the main advantage was Israel's open door to Soviet Jews. Thousands were emigrating from behind the Iron Curtain, many with valuable knowledge of Soviet defense systems, factories, or intelligence practices. Some arrived willingly, eager to share what they knew. Others came under quiet agreements, offering information in exchange for safe passage. The KGB, of course, saw the same opportunity. They planted sleepers, agents disguised as emigrants, inside these waves, sending them to Israel with cover stories, fake identities, and subtle instructions to infiltrate government or military institutions once they settled. This back and forth created a dangerous double-agent ecosystem where nobody could be sure who was working for whom. One of Mossad's earliest breakthroughs came from an unlikely source: a young technician who had worked in a Soviet radar installation near Odessa. Interrogated quietly upon arrival in Israel, he revealed not only the frequencies of the newest Soviet anti-aircraft systems, but also the names of KGB handlers in Cyprus, who were funneling information to Arab states. That intelligence allowed Mossad to launch a counter-operation. Posing as Soviet-aligned intermediaries, Israeli operatives fed false technical data back to the KGB's network in Cyprus. Within months, several Soviet-built SAM sites in Egypt malfunctioned or underperformed during test firings, a direct result of this disinformation campaign. But the KGB was no amateur. They understood Mossad's tactics and moved to counter them. In one case, they flipped a mid-level Israeli defense scientist, Marcus Klingberg, who passed biological research secrets to Moscow for over 20 years before being caught in the 1980s. Klingberg's betrayal shocked Israel's security establishment. It proved the KGB could burrow into the very heart of Israel's scientific military complex. Klingberg wasn't alone. Several minor clerks, translators, and drivers inside Israeli embassies in Europe were later revealed to be Soviet informants. Some had been blackmailed, their parents or siblings still living under Soviet control. Others were simply ideological, disillusioned with Israel or seduced by Soviet promises. For Mossad, each discovery was a race against time. Catch the mole before a crisis erupted. The tradecraft in this secret war was classic Cold War spycraft, but in many cases perfected to an art. In Vienna, Brussels, and West Berlin, dead drops, hollow park benches, false-bottomed trash bins, magnetic pouches under bridges became the preferred method of passing data. Microdots hidden inside postcards, messages encoded in prayer books. Even diplomatic pouches were repurposed to smuggle out or bring in secret communications. Every meeting carried the risk of surveillance. Every defection was a chess match. Perhaps the most dramatic episode of this era unfolded in Paris, 1968. A KGB resident, station chief, in the Soviet embassy began hinting to intermediaries that he might be willing to talk. He had grown disillusioned after years of seeing Moscow's policies in the Middle East. Mossad dispatched a clean team, operatives with no previous ties to the defector, to handle the approach. Over a series of covert meetings in safe houses, they extracted lists of KGB informants in Lebanon and Syria. That information led to the quiet roll-up of several KGB-backed spy cells operating near Israel's northern border. But the operation ended abruptly when the KGB learned of the betrayal. The resident disappeared, and his body was never found. The message was clear: the KGB would protect its networks at any cost. Meanwhile, the Middle East itself was becoming a live laboratory for this clandestine rivalry. In Cairo and Damascus, Soviet advisors, really KGB officers under diplomatic cover, trained Arab intelligence services to counter Israeli spies. They taught interrogation techniques, cryptography, and surveillance. At the same time, Mossad ran covert networks inside those same cities, smuggling out documents, bribing low-level clerks, and occasionally turning entire Arab officers who resented Soviet control. The result was a strange and deadly triangular game. Mossad spying on Soviet-trained Arab services, the KGB countering Mossad, and both agencies using the same city streets as battlegrounds. The rise of double agents turned this war into a hall of mirrors. Some defectors from the KGB were actually triple agents sent to feed disinformation to Mossad. Some of Mossad's own supposed successes were carefully orchestrated traps. A famous case occurred in the early 1970s when a Syrian officer offered Israel a treasure trove of Soviet-supplied missile data. Mossad exfiltrated him at great risk. Only years later did they realize much of the information was planted disinformation, a KGB sting designed to mislead Israeli military planners. This constant deception forced Mossad to become more rigorous in vetting its sources, creating layers of compartmentalization and internal counterintelligence far more advanced than its size would suggest. Inside Israel, the public knew little or nothing of this hidden war. Occasionally, headlines would mention a Soviet spy ring broken up in Tel Aviv or a mysterious assassination in Europe. But the scale of the struggle, hundreds of informants, dozens of covert operations, stayed buried in classified archives. For Mossad officers, this was more than a job. It was existential. Each KGB penetration risked exposing Israeli operations in Egypt, Syria, and even inside the Soviet bloc itself. Each compromised agent meant Israeli pilots or soldiers might die in a future war. For the KGB, it was a matter of prestige. Outwitting Mossad proved Moscow could still dominate the intelligence chessboard despite the CIA's global reach. By the early 1970s, both sides had scored victories and suffered humiliations. Mossad had dismantled several Soviet-backed spy rings in the Middle East. The KGB had successfully planted long-term moles inside Israel's defense research. The secret war had no front lines, no public announcements, no medals, but its outcomes were reshaping how conflicts in the Middle East would be fought. And as the tension built, one region was becoming the next great chess square for both services. The Middle Eastern battlefields themselves: Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, where Soviet advisors and Mossad assets were already circling each other, preparing for a showdown that would explode during the Yom Kippur War. By the early 1970s, the Cold War's shadow had stretched deep into the Middle East. What began as quiet surveillance between Mossad and the KGB had now evolved into a full-blown intelligence war fought across deserts, embassies, and battlefields. Each side understood that whoever dominated the region's information networks would shape the outcome of every Arab-Israeli conflict for decades to come. Israel's wars in 1967 and 1973 weren't just military showdowns. They were contests of intelligence. And behind those conflicts lay a silent duel between Moscow and Tel Aviv, fought through espionage, deception, and disinformation. In Damascus, Soviet advisors had embedded themselves deep within the Syrian military structure. They trained radar operators, missile crews, and communications officers, ensuring that every Soviet-made weapon stayed under Moscow's watch. But Mossad had already planted its own sources: engineers, interpreters, and junior officers who quietly reported back on Soviet deployments. These informants sent details of radar frequencies, SAM site positions, and troop rotations, intelligence that would later become critical in Israel's preemptive strikes. In Cairo, the KGB and Egyptian intelligence worked hand in hand. Soviet advisors ran special listening posts near Alexandria and Port Said, intercepting Israeli radio chatter. They supplied advanced signal intercept equipment and encryption systems, confident their technology would give Arab forces an edge. But Mossad had anticipated this. Through its own covert operations, many routed through European intermediaries, it obtained the specifications of Soviet cryptographic devices, effectively allowing Israel to read Egyptian transmissions in real time. The result was a dangerous equilibrium, each side believing it was one step ahead, yet both continuously outmaneuvered in a game where even victory was temporary. When the Yom Kippur War erupted in October 1973, that hidden chessboard suddenly caught fire. While Israeli soldiers fought on the Sinai and Golan Heights, the Mossad and KGB were locked in their own invisible combat. Soviet intelligence officers fed daily updates to Arab command posts, troop positions, weather conditions, and intercepts from Israeli radio channels. Meanwhile, Mossad scrambled to intercept those Soviet transmissions, disrupt command lines, and plant disinformation within enemy networks. One of Mossad's boldest counter-operations took place during this time: the infiltration of Soviet-supplied radar systems in Egypt. Using prior technical data stolen years earlier, Israeli technicians jammed enemy radar arrays during critical air sorties, creating blind corridors that allowed Israeli pilots to strike undetected. The KGB quickly realized something was wrong. Their advisors in Cairo accused Egyptian crews of incompetence, unaware that Mossad's earlier intelligence coup had turned Soviet electronics against them. It was a stunning victory of brains over firepower, but it came at a cost. The KGB responded by tightening its control over all Soviet-aligned militaries in the region. In the aftermath of the war, the battleground shifted again, this time to Beirut, Athens, and Nicosia. where intelligence networks collided in shadow wars that rarely reached headlines. Beirut became the beating heart of KGB operations in the Middle East. Using diplomatic cover, KGB residents coordinated arms transfers, propaganda, and surveillance operations against Israeli interests. Mossad, in turn, infiltrated the city's underworld. Smugglers, journalists, and businessmen who became eyes and ears inside Soviet networks. The line between espionage and warfare blurred. In one notorious episode, a KGB courier disappeared en route from Beirut to Damascus. His diplomatic pouch, intercepted by Mossad agents disguised as customs officials, contained microfilm detailing Soviet military shipments to Syria. The courier was never seen again, another nameless casualty of the secret war. At the same time, Mossad was orchestrating psychological operations to fracture Soviet influence. They spread rumors within Arab armies that the Soviets were withholding critical technology, deliberately sabotaging Arab chances of victory. These subtle campaigns sowed distrust between Moscow and its clients, forcing the KGB to divert attention inward, policing its own allies. But the KGB struck back hard. Their Active Measures campaign sought to undermine Israel on the world stage. Soviet operatives flooded European and African newspapers with fabricated stories accusing Israel of espionage against its allies. They planted forged diplomatic cables, suggesting Mossad's infiltration of Western governments. The aim was simple: isolate Israel diplomatically and weaken Mossad's ability to operate globally. Inside Israel, the KGB's hand could also be felt. Several Soviet new immigrants were later discovered to be moles, quietly sending details about Israel's nuclear program in Dimona and its growing ties with Washington. The exposure of one such network in the mid-1970s triggered an internal Mossad purge, leading to the quiet dismissal of several officers suspected of negligence or compromise. Mossad learned the lesson the hard way. In a war of deception, trust was the first casualty. Meanwhile, the battlefield continued to evolve. The late 1970s brought new arenas, Lebanon and Afghanistan. While the KGB poured resources into suppressing Islamic insurgents in Central Asia, Mossad shifted focus to the Levant, where Palestinian factions supported by Soviet arms were threatening Israeli borders. Here, the proxy war between the two agencies became even bloodier. KGB trainers instructed Palestinian groups in covert tactics, while Mossad teams sabotaged arms depots and intercepted Soviet weapons shipments along the Mediterranean routes. It was an era defined by plausible deniability, where explosions, assassinations, and disappearances were officially accidents or local disputes. But everyone in the intelligence community knew otherwise. Perhaps the most defining aspect of this spy war was its mutual respect beneath mutual hatred. KGB officers grudgingly acknowledged Mossad's efficiency, its discipline, and its uncanny ability to predict moves before they happened. Mossad operatives, in turn, respected the KGB's professionalism and vast resources. This strange duality, rivals yet mirrors, shaped their tactics for decades. Mossad even studied declassified Soviet tradecraft manuals to understand its enemy's psychology, while the KGB analyzed Mossad's operations after each failure or success. Both sides were evolving, learning from one another. And that evolution would lead directly into the next phase: covert defections, assassinations, and global power plays, where the line between spy and soldier would vanish entirely. By the early 1980s, the world had entered a new phase of intelligence warfare. Satellites replaced pigeons, computers replaced codebooks. But one truth remained unchanged. The Mossad and the KGB were still locked in the same deadly dance, each one determined to outlast the other. As the Cold War entered its twilight, Their competition would move beyond the Middle East, into Europe, Africa, and even inside the United States, in a final, ruthless contest for dominance that would define the last great battles of 20th century espionage. By the mid-1980s, the Cold War was cracking, not from gunfire, but from exhaustion. The Soviet Union was bleeding resources in Afghanistan, drowning under its own bureaucracy and facing uprisings from the very nations it once controlled. But in the shadows, Mossad and the KGB were still fighting their private war, one that had outlived most of the politicians who started it. Unlike the public superpower rivalry, this hidden conflict wasn't about ideology. It was about control over information, defections, and influence. Both agencies knew the end game was approaching, and each wanted to emerge from the coming collapse stronger than ever. In 1982, Israel's invasion of Lebanon opened a new front in their secret battle. The KGB saw the chaos as an opportunity to re-establish Soviet leverage in the Arab world, funneling weapons through Syrian intelligence and Palestinian proxies. Mossad, meanwhile, operated in the ruins of Beirut like a surgeon with a scalpel. Every refugee camp, embassy, and militia headquarters became a potential listening post or recruitment ground. Among the wreckage, Mossad captured several Soviet advisors embedded with Palestinian factions, men who officially didn't exist. Their interrogations revealed something startling. The KGB had been monitoring Mossad operations across Europe, using embassies, trade delegations, and front companies to track Israeli agents abroad. It was proof that even as the Soviet Empire decayed, its intelligence network remained lethal. But Mossad had evolved. Gone were the days of simple wiretaps and human couriers. The agency was now fusing technology with psychology, employing sophisticated signal interception systems and surveillance tools decades ahead of their time. They hacked into radio frequencies used by Soviet naval vessels in the Mediterranean. They intercepted encrypted diplomatic messages from Soviet embassies in Athens and Rome. Bit by bit, Mossad dismantled the KGB's illusion of invisibility, and yet the KGB refused to yield. In Moscow, a new generation of intelligence officers trained in counterintelligence and cyber tactics took charge under the first chief directorate, determined to preserve the Soviet footprint in the Middle East. They intensified operations to recruit Israeli scientists, engineers, and even journalists. They targeted the children of Soviet émigrés living in Israel. Young, ambitious, bilingual, and vulnerable to blackmail. Mossad responded with quiet ruthlessness. Double agents were turned back, disinformation campaigns were launched, and dozens of suspected KGB-linked operatives disappeared during short trips through Eastern Europe. No official records exist. No one claimed responsibility. But within the intelligence community, the message was unmistakable. Mossad would not allow Soviet spies to infiltrate its core again. As the 1980s wore on, the balance of power began to tip. The Soviet Union was disintegrating under its own contradictions, and the KGB, once the most feared intelligence service on Earth, was fragmenting from within. Mossad, sensing opportunity, shifted strategy from defense to extraction. Israeli operatives orchestrated a series of covert exfiltrations from Eastern Europe and Central Asia, smuggling out scientists, mathematicians, and engineers with sensitive Soviet technology. Many of these operations ran through Vienna, Prague, and Budapest under the cover of cultural exchange programs. For every successful exfiltration, the KGB lost not just secrets, but prestige. One such operation, known quietly among intelligence veterans as Operation Night Crossing, involved the defection of a Soviet radar engineer carrying classified schematics of early missile tracking systems. That technology would later enhance Israel's own missile defense research, laying early groundwork for the systems it uses today. But the most decisive blow to the KGB came from within. In 1987, a series of high-level defections shattered its operational security. Mossad, through its European networks, played a subtle yet significant role in facilitating some of those escapes, including the extraction of informants who provided details about Soviet arms shipments to Syria and Libya. By the time the Berlin Wall began to crumble, much of the KGB's Middle Eastern intelligence network was already compromised. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, it wasn't a clean ending, it was an implosion. Files were burned, agents abandoned, and loyalties sold to the highest bidder. In the chaos, Mossad agents moved quickly. They secured contacts, intercepted shipments, and recruited disoriented ex-KGB officers who suddenly found themselves unemployed. Men who had once hunted Israelis now found sanctuary in Tel Aviv or Europe, offering intelligence in exchange for safety. It was the ultimate irony of the Cold War's finale. The hunters became the informants. Inside Israel, the collapse of the KGB's presence was viewed not as a victory to celebrate, but as a warning to adapt. A secret internal memo, circulated among Mossad's senior leadership in early 1992, summarized it best. The adversary is gone, but the methods remain. Tomorrow, they will belong to someone else. And indeed, they did. Many former KGB officers reappeared in the 2000s within Russia's new intelligence structures, the FSB and SVR, carrying both old grudges and old knowledge. Some even re-established quiet channels with Israel, not as enemies, but as cautious collaborators in the shifting geopolitics of the post-9/11 world. Mossad, meanwhile, had learned enduring lessons from its decades-long duel with the KGB. That technology can fail where human instinct prevails. That ideology fades, but information never loses value. And that the true battlefield of espionage is not fought with bullets or bombs, but with silence, patience, and perception. In the end, the Mossad-KGB rivalry left no monuments, no medals, and no heroes, but it reshaped the DNA of modern intelligence. Israel's operational precision, its ability to execute complex missions with surgical timing, was forged in the crucible of surviving Soviet intelligence. Likewise, Russian tradecraft, paranoia, and counterintelligence doctrines still bear the imprint of their Mossad encounters. The two agencies remain linked by history, even if they now face new enemies. And while the Cold War may be over, its shadows continue to stretch across new conflicts. From cyber warfare to proxy battles in Syria and Ukraine, where the fingerprints of those old spy masters still linger. If you thought the Mossad-KGB spy war ended with the Cold War, think again. Because in the next declassified file, we'll uncover how the same tactics, deception, infiltration, and digital espionage have evolved into a new battlefield. A war no longer fought in alleys and embassies, but in servers and code. Subscribe so you don't miss the next classified file.